Hello, and welcome to our final episode of the first season of 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones, in which we'll be talking about the Spellcoats. I'm Rebecca Framel.
And I'm Emily Tesh, and I'm really looking forward to discussing the Spellcoats, which is in some ways a departure and in other ways feels like a culmination of all the work Jones was doing through the 70s, and which is the third book of the Delmark Quartet. But that quartet actually is about to remain a trilogy for more than a
Yes.
decade. The fourth book will not come out until the 1990s, so the Spellcoats is a stopping point. I'm interested to discuss what effect that has on our understanding of the series.
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting recording because I remember Crown of Dalemark pretty well. I've read it a couple times, and you don't. And
I've
I'm
completely forgotten everything that happened in Crown of Dalemark. I remember reading it 2019. I last read it, and I remember it blew my mind, but I don't remember why.
So we'll get there. I'm going to try not to spoil you. There may be stuff that comes up where I'm like, what we'll see in Crown.
We're not meant to look forward, are we? I do remember, spoiling Drown Amit, that Mitt ends up as King of Dalemark. And I do think that's actually important for understanding Spellcoats as well, because Spellcoats to me is a book about a king.
Yes. Well, it's a couple things. Well, it's not a sequel really to Cart and Quitter and Drowned Amit. It's doing a different thing, but it is deeply in conversation with both of those texts because it's a book about a king and it's a book about a creative younger sibling with a deeply divided sense of self. And it's a book about bad marriages. It's a book about gods.
I mean, it's doing the same thing Jones does throughout Dalemark, which is rather than direct sequels, she does thematic sequels. But to me, like the trilogy, if you like, these three 1970s Dalemark books is like thesis, antithesis, fuck synthesis, we're going back.
Yes.
Spellcoats is set in prehistoric Dalemark. So Cart and Quitter and Drowned Amit are parallel books. They're happening more or less at the same time with completely different sets of characters. Spellcoats is hundreds, possibly thousands of years earlier in a pre-literate society, or at least a differently literate society, and the spellcoats of the title are, on the very last page, revealed to be archaeological artifacts that have been dug up and translated in modern Dalemark. And Jones actually, in I think what must be a later edition, the glossary, the fantasy glossary at the end, is like, translated not always very accurately.
Yes. Throughout the book, I think this is one of the most interesting things about the book because this is really, we've talked about her point of view control and we've talked about how much she's, make sure that she's limited to what any given character knows and what any given character can understand and how they're seeing the world. But this is the first time that she's really playing with unreliable narration. And on multiple different levels, she is constantly putting into question the narration that we are being given in through this artifact. So I don't have the glossary. I have a map, but not the glossary. But I do have the final note, the archaeological note that also says, we didn't really know how to translate these artifacts. And also, I'm going to come back to this final note. I think at some point we're probably just going to have to read out the whole thing. But it says the story is largely self-explanatory, but certain obscurities in the text have been amended to avoid confusing the reader. So at the end, we're like, this is through a translation filter, but also in the middle, multiple times, we're given reasons to question what is being presented in the text, not because Tanakui, who is the protagonist, is trying to lie to us, but just through the means of storytelling.
I have to say, I'm not sure I would define Tanakui as a protagonist. She is the narrator, and I think one of the things the book does is draw your attention to whether or not those two are the same thing. Tanakui is the storyteller. She is the person, she's the weaver who has created these spellcoats, and a spellcoat is, literally, it's a large coat that is woven on a loom, and it has within it words that are spelled out in the pattern of the weave. So this is this society's form of writing. You have to weave your writing. So that spell literally is in spelling words, but also spell as in magic. And of course, those two words are connected. Magic, spell, spelling your words, those are the same thing. Because a spellcoat ultimately is a form of magic, and Tanakui although never quite explicitly for herself, is sort of revealed over time as a powerful sorceress, a witch, and the spellcoats are her work of
She does
magic.
come to understand that at the very end. I think in like the final chapter is really when she starts talking about her spellcoats as magic and herself as a witch. But we know that she's coming to that understanding all throughout the course of making the text because of the way in which the text is written. So the actual story is broken up over the form of two of these coats, and they're woven at different times. Both of them are woven after the action is happening. So the first half of the book, the first coat, is Tanaqui and her siblings taking a journey up the river, fleeing from their village where they're being discriminated against because they're under invasion, and this family resembles the invaders, which makes their village reject them and come to attack them, and so they have to flee. And after there's a whole long journey, there's a confrontation with an evil mage, there's a lot of growth and sort of understanding about the world, and at the end of all that journey, we get suddenly a drop into, okay, I'm weaving this from the future, but oh my god, everything's happening, I have to go. Then the second coat happens, and we get the rest of that journey down the river, at which point Tanaqui gets set up in a stable situation for a while, weaves the first coat, starts weaving the second coat. Much more happens. She's weaving the second coat in media res in a great hurry because at that point she's come to understand that she needs to finish weaving the coats because that is part of the spell that the narrative is weaving that will also defeat the evil necromancer who's coming to take over the land.
Yeah, I gotta say, one thing I really enjoy about this book is that it is full high fantasy in a way Jones has not done before and will not really do again, not
Never.
unironically. Because this is a book about how the kingdom is under attack by an evil wizard who does necromancy, and the people must come together under the new king to defeat him. It couldn't be more high fantasy if it tried, but it's doing it in an interesting way.
Yes.
Going back to point of view control, I want to add as well, and I think this is really important, this is our first person
Yes.
novel, isn't it?
It's our first person novel, and it's our first novel narrated by a young woman.
Right, first female protagonist. Like, Hildy, I think, is a deuteragonist in Drowned Amit. She's very much part of the story. She gets point of view sections, but it's not her story. Drowned Amit is Mitt's story.
Yes.
Tanaqui is the narrator, the lens, the point of view character, all the way through Spellcoats, and it is first person. We are right there in her head, in her voice, in her weaving. I mean, Jones's point of view control is so tight that even her third person feels a little bit like first in terms of like information control and in how little you're allowed to see outside that specific character's head. So that very, very tight third person point of view, which actually is something I admire very much and is an influence on my own work, is what Jones specializes in. But this first person is, if you like, taking off the mask of it, or revealing that this is the trick and always was the trick, that you are in a very specific perspective.
Yes. And there's even, I'm trying to find the quote. Early on in the book, when Tanaqui is talking about weaving, she talks about how she made up, like when she was learning how to weave, there are signs for a bunch of things that didn't exist. And so she had to make them up. And so she says, I don't even know if anyone will be able to read this properly or understand me properly because of all the different signs that I made up in that are just private language between me and my sister and my family. So again, with this, she's an intensely personal story that she is telling in her own language that she's essentially invented, that someone else is coming along and being like, well, we think this is what she meant here. But inherently there's this sense that we are never going to understand the truth of this story. And then she's very Tanaqui as a narrator is very upfront about when things happen that she doesn't understand or that she experiences differently from someone else in her family. There will be sequences where she'll be like, well, I think this is what happened. But Hearn, my brother, and I guess we should go through and introduce all the siblings in a minute, will say, this isn't what happened at all. This other thing happened. But I still think I'm right.
Right. One thing that's very sort of consistent about Tanaqui is she thinks she's
yes.
right. And I enjoy her very much as a narrator, actually. She is very clearly a person of great stubbornness. That's her flaw, stubbornness and sort of a narrow view. So she is the younger sister in this family of 5 siblings,
Yes.
right? So the oldest is Gull, her oldest brother, then Robin, her sister, and Robin is presented as sort of mid to late teens, I
Yeah,
think.
I think at one point she says, like, Robin, she considers Robin an adult or sort of an adult. Like, she says there were 3 children and an adult going down the river, but adult to Tanaqui is not necessarily adult.
Yes. And then there is Hearn and Tanaqui, who seem to be quite close
I
in
think
age. Hearn is a little bit
they're
older.
1 year apart, it says, because at one point they're talking about Tanaqui has never seen gulls before, and Hearn says, "But I've seen gulls. I remember gulls, and I'm only a year older than you. So how is it that you don't remember?"
Absolutely. And then the youngest brother is Mallard, nicknamed Duck,
Yes,
which ends up being important for his magic. We have a proper Le Guinian moment at one point where not knowing the true name of this boy gives him remarkable power. In fact, I will say in Spellcoats, I thought I could see a Le Guin influence, an Earthsea influence, or at least an overlap, especially thinking about how Jones, at this point in her career, is reading a lot of American science fiction.
yeah, I think there's a couple things she's doing that seem to me to be at least a little bit influenced by Le Guin, and some in is taking it in different ways, and I guess we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, so you've got these 5 siblings, right? The 3 boys who are all named after water birds. Robin, who's a bird but not a water bird. So we've got gull, hern, which is an old word for heron, and mallard slash duck, and the girls Robin and Tanaqui. And they've lived a perfectly happy life next to the river. Their mother has died some time ago. Their father, Closty the clam,
Another
so
great
called,
name.
such a good name. I actually went and thought where she got that word from, and I went and looked up Closty, and I was like, oh, this is derived from the same root as closed, because he's a guy who doesn't talk
Right.
much, which ends up being a bit of a problem when it turns out that they do not have a lot of very important information
Right.
because their father never told them.
And I'm going to go ahead and bring out a great reveal now, just because I think it's very funny that we eventually learned that their mother was essentially a river goddess who fell in love with this man and, gave up her immortality to marry him and have his children. This man is Closty the Clam.
Right. It is extremely funny. It's one of the many, many forbidden romances that governs this book. Is the romance of their river goddess mother and their human father, but she's gone now.
Yes.
And I'm going to add as well, this family has their family undying.
Yes.
Who are gods?
Yeah.
Question mark?
So I think I keep wanting to use the word. I've just used the word god, goddess like 5 times, and I know I don't have like we hadn't introduced the word undying yet, but I think we've got to use the word undying because towards the end it becomes explicit that they are not gods. And in fact, one of the most important things that Tanaqui thinks is one of the most important things that's said in the book is when one of the undying explains to her. She says, "What good are you? You're gods." And hang on, I think I've got the quote.
Tanamil fetched himself up onto one elbow and said, very earnestly, a very strange thing. I never called myself that, he said. Neither I nor any of the undying ever made that claim. It is a claim men made for us, and that is how we came to be bound. I told Tanamil I was sorry. I think this, he said, is one of the strongest threads of my weaving.
Yes. So they're not gods, even though they function sort of as gods in the course of the book. The humans treat them as gods. But that's not what
Humans
they
make
are.
them into gods, yeah.
Yeah, but that's not what they are, not how they want to be thought of. Which will become important as we learn Tanaqui and her family's relationship to them.
Right. And this sort of direct introduction of these divine figures, I think, is interesting in a book that's following as a sequel to Drowned Ammit, where we've had the gods of Holland at the end, Ammit and Libby, are now sort of reframed as undying? Question
Yes.
mark? What does it mean to be the undying if it doesn't mean being gods?
Right. It does mean clearly having great power, but it's also like there's something so interesting in the way the Undying are presented throughout this book. And there's all these moments where Tanaqui interacts with them, and very carefully the way in which they're depicted. It's an assortment of natural features that Tanaqui looks at out of the corner of her eye, and it's someone that she can speak to and someone that she can talk to, and then she looks at it directly, and it's a combination of shadows. It's a rock and a tree and a mountain. It's there's something that's sort of really deeply of and about the world, like the real natural world about
Right.
these figures.
Right, they are of the land. And this land is not yet called Dalemark, it's called the Riverlands. And it doesn't look like Dalemark either. Your copy of the book has the map, mine doesn't, so you showed me the map. And it is not the same as the map of Dalemark that exists in the previous books, because it is dominated by a central river, which is
Yes.
also the dominating theme of the story is a journey first down the river to the sea and then up the river to its source. That's the journey that these five siblings have to take.
And the people of the village worship the river as a god. And Tanaqui very confidently is like, they're absolutely wrong. That's so stupid. The river is not a god.
Right, Tanaqui thinks the undying of her family are the correct undying to worship, and they are three figures, clay figures or carved figures that she keeps that are kept by the fire and taken care of there. The one, which appears to be the figure of an older man, the younger one,
Yes.
who is a figure of a younger man, and the lady, which is the figure of a woman.
And they're made out of different materials. The one is like cold, hard, blistering is the word that Tanaqui uses, which I don't love as a word because it makes me think of blistering. But it means, sort of like, I think it's sort of meant to indicate like metallic stone. The young one is made out of kind of reddish clay, and the lady is carved out of wood.
And in fact, Tanaqui has a memory of her father carving the lady,
Right before her mother
which
died.
right before her mother died. And it becomes clear over the course of the book that the lady and her mother, the river goddess, are one and the same. And
Which
that
Duck,
this.
who's the youngest one, knows from the beginning, way before Tanaqui figures it out. Duck is always like, "Oh, I'll carry the lady," and anytime anyone else is like, "Well, other people would like to sometimes carry our most friendly goddess," Duck is like, "No, she is mine. I am carrying her. I love mommy best."
Yeah, Duck, the baby of the family, very much plays into the baby of the family role, I think.
Yes, and Tanaqui has like it's interesting that we are getting this from Tanaqui's point of view because she has very specific relationships to all these siblings. She has, and like by virtue of being in between Hearn and Duck, but not a boy. There's all this. We get a lot of attention on, kind of the relationship that Hearn and Duck have to each other as siblings, which is a kind of brother relationship that we've seen in Diana Wynne Jones before. And Tanaqui kind of wanting to insert herself into that to like roughhouse and argue with them, but also being pulled away from that by her relationship with Robin, by Robin as the oldest girl, as the parentified oldest girl, the mother figure, running around and being like, "Oh, I've got to do all this stuff. Why does nobody help me? Tanaqui, please stop being a problem with the boys and come and help me do this and that and make sure that we actually survive this experience." And which Tanaqui is, I think, quite resentful about.
I would say Tanaqui is deeply resentful of anything that pulls her towards girlhood, and she has this really nasty attitude to Robin for most of the book, and she acknowledges it. She says, I knew I was being unkind. I can't seem to make myself be nice to Robin. She annoys me when she goes all ladylike, when she goes all helpless. And you can see Tanaqui sort of has this deep, ooh, this really like visceral reaction to Robin's femininity.
Right.
And there's also a sequence in the very opening pages of the book, the sort of underlying conflict of the book, right, is that the Riverlands have been invaded by people whom the locals call the heathens, who come across the water and look different. So the Riverlanders are pale skinned with straight dark hair, and the heathens have brown skin and curly fair hair. And our protagonists, this group of siblings, look more like the heathens, and this is part of why their village eventually rejects them, and it's suggested that they actually resemble their mother, this goddess.
Yes.
Right, start of the book, the king of the Riverlands has sent out his men to collect up village men to join the army, and the children's father, Closty, and the oldest brother, Gull, are taken off to be in the army, and Tanaqui, because she's a girl, can't go, and she is furious. She is very upset. Hearn can't go either because he's too young.
Right. So Tanaqui probably couldn't go even if she were a boy because she's also too young, being younger than Hearn. But the thing that she prays to, or that prays to the Undying to, is to make her a boy so that she can go off and be a hero.
Right. And so that almost like the first thing we know about Tanaqui is that she wants to be a boy, and she's very annoyed when the Undying don't do it. There's a very bitter "I am still a girl." And I know I've been saying, like, all along, since 8 Days of Luke, I think, do you kind of feel like there are some transgender themes in Diana Wynne Jones' early work? Like, am I reading too much into this? This interest in masculinity, this admiration and love for masculinity, this rejection of femininity. First female protagonist we've got. I wish I was a boy. I hate being a girl.
Yep.
I'm really annoyed that I'm not a boy. I prayed, and it didn't change anything.
Yes, and we've brought out that quote also. I think it was during the 8 Days of Luke episode, where she talks about Brunhilde and how Diana Wynne Jones talks about Brunhilde and how this was the first character, the first figure that made her understand that a girl could be a hero. Because previous to that, she hadn't seen a model of heroism for young women. And I think this call to be a hero is what Tanakui longs for, and in fact, like she has this fantasy that she is, and she talks about it in the first coat. Let me find the quote that she is going to be. I found a way to comfort myself by pretending I was a very fierce and warlike person called Tanakui, the terror of the heathen. When the messengers came back to Shelling, I pretended they would hear of this person and send Zwit to fetch her to lead our land to war. I told it to our Undying to make it seem more true. I wish now that I had not done that. Sometimes I think this is what brought such troubles on us. You should not speak falsehoods to the Undying. So her dream is to go off to war and fight valiantly and be like this, and you enter this heroic masculinity.
Yep. And this idea of the sort of the masculine hero figure has just come back again and again and again in these books. And Tanakui never gets to do that. The role she is in is a role of storyteller.
Yes. She is the magician and the weaver in a way that puts her, I think, closer to Duck, the younger brother, than any of her other siblings. So we were talking a little bit about this also as a sequel to Cart and Quitter, and as a sequel to the Myths of Dalemark, where we see Morrill enter his power as the magician, the magician musician. That's eventually what Duck will become, the youngest brother. But it's
And in
also
fact, Duck, I think we can reveal this, Duck will eventually take on the name Tanner Morrill,
right.
which is, he is the character Morrill is going to be named after, the sort of legendary musician mage of Dalemark.
Yes. And Tanakui also, like Morrill, is a character who performs an art, a creativity, and through the course of performing that creativity comes to understand herself and comes to understand the story she is telling, and then learns how telling that truth can be used to actually change the world around her.
Right, because truth is the fire that fetches thunder. I think that is almost the running heart of Dalemark, is the truth of art and the power of that truth. And the Spellcoat certainly is about first you tell the story, then you find out what the truth you were telling was, so that you understand the story, so you can tell it again, but with power.
Right. And there's a point in the story when they sort of first start to come into their gifts. And this is they've gone down the river, they've fled from their village because it's become very clear they've learned from their uncle, who's the one person in the village who's kind to them, and who has brought back their brother, who at first seems to be suffering from PTSD, and then it becomes increasingly clear is not just extreme PTSD, but also malign magical influence.
Yeah, he's under an evil spell.
Yes. And they start going up the river, and when they're partway through, they meet a mysterious young man who takes them all in for a night and teaches them things. And it would, eventually, at first they think that this, they meet this young man, Tanakui, they have kind of a hallucinatory sequence where they eat delicious food and hang out in what seems to be a great hall, and he teaches them all sorts of things. He teaches Duck how to pipe. He teaches Hearn something. Tanakui isn't paying super attention, but she likes it when he's teaching Hearn how to wrestle, and she's like, oh, me too, I would like to learn how to wrestle as well.
Right, what
And
he teaches Hearn seems to involve like drawing diagrams and sketching in the dust, which suggests to me that it's probably military strategy for reasons that will
right,
become clear later. And definitely
exactly.
the other things he's teaching Hearn are about fighting.
Yes. And he shows her about the fighting, but but that never really comes up, and Tanakui never actually uses it. In fact, she says, "I'm not sure I should use this knowledge, having learned how to throw people to the ground." But what he does show her is the right pattern for the. She says, "I told him that there were many words I did not know how to weave." He said there was no harm in making your own patterns, provided you taught others what you meant. But he said you must use the right pattern for the river. That is important, and showed me weaving with rushes. He also showed me a more expressive way of twisting yarn. He had me twist rushes until I could do it. He said, when you use yarn twisted this way, use it for the strongest parts of your story. Your meaning will leap from the cloth. So vitally, he teaches her how to use italics in her Spellcoats writing.
Right, but he teaches her how to deepen the power that is her power, which is the power of storytelling. And in the same way that Duck's power, he is going to be a musician mage, so he learns music from Tanamil, and Hearn has a future that is about war and leadership, and he learns the skills he needs. We've missed a sibling. What about Robin? What does Robin get from Tanamil?
Robin and Tanimil have a tremendous fight that Tanakui doesn't understand at all.
Right, I'm gonna say, like, this is not a serious reading. This is a joke. Tanakui is a trans ace icon. Tanakui does not approve of gender and does not understand why everybody keeps falling in love with everyone else.
Yeah, this is so far of the entire 70s. This is, I would say, the only book that's really concerned with romance. That's not true. 8 Days of Luke is also profoundly concerned with romance in much the same way that Spellcoats is concerned with romance. The difference is that in 8 Days of Luke, David is having a heroic romance and doesn't really realize it, whereas Tanakui is standing back, watching her siblings form these profound romantic connections that will change their lives, and be like, "Oh God, why?"
You people are so embarrassing
and annoying.
Yeah.
Please stop wringing your hands.
Right, so Robin and Tanamil, this mysterious wizard, mysterious, sad, magically bound, sorceress being with musical powers whose name begins with T. Keep track of that, because we are going to see more guys like this.
Yes.
I can think of 4 already.
Yep. Mysterious wizard who is meets a young woman with
A
no
much,
power.
much younger woman, because he's an ancient immortal and she is, what, 16?
Yes. It's actually very funny that later on, Tanakui meets her mother and is like, "Oh God, I'm afraid he's our uncle," and her mother's like, "No, it's fine. He's not our uncle." Which, when you consider that first in this book we know that Tanakui's parents were related, that in some way Tanakui, because her they're both descended from the one who is the sort of the river undying. Her mother is his daughter, and her
father is a distant descendant.
Right. And this pattern will recur again in Crown of Delmark.
I'll have to take a word for it. I do not remember that at all, but it's very funny to me.
And it's also one that we've seen before in Charmed Life, where we have close cousins who marry and have very powerful children. But this time it's fine. Robin and Tanamil are not related. Despite the fact that Tanamil's name means younger brother and he's a tributary river of the Great River, but don't worry about it.
Don't think about it too hard. So Robin and Tanamil fall in love, but Robin rejects him out of care for her siblings, out of a feeling of responsibility that she has to help them and go with them. And Tanamil says, you're in danger. You're not as powerful as they are. You're going to get hurt. It's all going to go wrong. And Robin said, well, should I just give up because I'm weak? Which actually I think is one of the moments in the book where you can kind of see that Tanakui's nastiness towards Robin is an unjustified resentment of what is actually quite a heroic character. That Robin is the parentified eldest daughter, and her form of heroism is it's actually what Jones brought up in Reflections when she was talking about sort of feminine mythic heroes, the patient, the enduring, the long-suffering, the Penelope, if you like.
Yes.
Robin is patient and enduring and suffering and self-sacrificing because she feels responsible for her younger siblings. And with the three younger ones, she does go on down the river, and it does end up, in a complicated way, nearly killing her.
Yes, Robin actually reminds me of all the figures we've seen before. Robin reminds me most of Kathleen.
Yeah.
She's very good. She's she's sort of embodies all these virtues, but she's also, and it's really fun to see this figure from the point of view of this sort of heroic feminine figure from the point of view of a younger sister who's just really annoyed by her all the time. Whereas we, the reader, are like, oh no, Robin is a hero in the traditional sense, in the gendered traditional sense, but in the traditional sense. And she's patient, but she will stand up for herself. She will argue and kind of stand strong when she needs to. And like Kathleen, she is in a dangerous romance with a powerful yet powerless magical older divine figure who is obsessed with her.
Right, because all these Undying, or specifically the one and Tanamil, who is the same person as the younger one in the Undying, these Undying are bound. There is some kind of prison or limit or control on their power which prevents them from something. And specifically, it's preventing them from fighting back against the magical invasion of the Riverlands by these heathens.
Right. And so then, speaking of the heathens, shortly after, and we forgot a sibling as well, even after we've talked about Robin, Tanamal also has a significant interaction with Gull, who, for the first several chapters of this book, has been in the boat. It's like, you can see it's really distressing to Tanaqui, and as is often with the things that are really distressing to her, she doesn't talk about it much. There's a section much, much later on where she talks about Gull coming home and learning that her father's died, and she says, I had to unpick the long lament of my father. She wove it in, and then she took it out again. So there's this way
So it's explicitly like, there are things that are missing from this story because Tanaqui has chosen not to tell us.
Right, they are too personal. She doesn't want to talk about it. Gull coming back as this sort of shell of himself is something that is really, really distressing for all the siblings. And, they get in the boat, they have to feed him, they have to dress him. All he says is, we have to get on, we have to get out on the river, we have to get to the sea. His name is Gull, he is a seabird. But when they meet Tanamil is like, oh, well, okay, it's almost too late, but we can fix this. And with magical piping, turns Gull into another clay figure, like the rest of their Undying. And this is the first sort of real visible magic in the book, is the siblings watching as their brother sort of fades away and shrinks and disappears and becomes this Undying figure.
Right. And it's part of, I think, why Tanaqui is deeply suspicious of Tanamil, that, and she doesn't understand his argument with Robin, and she has a bad feeling about it. And, Tanamil does do the sort of, you've entered a magical kingdom thing of, we don't know how long we were there, we don't know what was happening, I can't remember any of it clearly. And Tanaqui, the storyteller, clearly feels it's very important that she should be able to remember and order things clearly in her mind in order to sort of gain the understanding, the control over events that she needs.
Right, and Hearn is also deeply offended by this. We haven't yet talked about Hearn and his main personality trait, which is so funny in this book specifically.
Hearn is my favourite character in this book, and I'm resisting talking about him because it's going to be too obvious he's my favourite.
But he's so good.
Right. Okay, so Hearn, the middle brother, his lead trait is he is an atheist. Which, in a fantasy book where people are constantly being gods or doing magic, is extremely funny. He's an atheist who doesn't believe in magic. And there are sequences where they're like, magic is literally happening right now. We can see it happening. And Hearn's like, well, that doesn't make it reasonable. And you know what? He's right, it's not.
Hearn is on Rationalist Tumblr. Hearn is like, this makes me so mad that I can't explain any of this. I just want to get it right in my mind, and it doesn't make any fucking sense.
But also, I think it is Hearn's idea. Sort of at the midpoint of the book, they go and confront the evil wizard who is trying to conquer the country. And Hearn's like, yeah, if he's an evil wizard, then the thing to do is to go and stand in front of him and not believe in him doing magic, and that will stop him.
And Duck, who is the magician sibling, is like, well, I think the thing that's going to stop him is more magic, actually.
I love Hearn. And I would actually say, I spoke earlier about how Tanaqui is the narrator, but not necessarily the protagonist of this book. And I think that Hearn is probably the protagonist of this book.
Yes.
And that, in a way, almost it's like, I forget where Jones wrote about this. It's in Reflections somewhere. She wrote about how she saw people as having an inner self that was of the opposite sex. So, and she was talking in terms of, I think, Christopher and Millie
Yes.
in Christopher Charm, which we'll come to next season, or possibly a season after. But Hearn and Tanaqui seem to me like two sides of a coin. And Hearn almost gets to have the life that Tanaqui wants. Her prayer to be a boy, to be the terror of the heathen, to take an active role in shaping her country. And Tanaqui is the one who tells Hearn's story. And in fact, in that sort of final archaeological note, it is Hearn who is the focus of the archaeologist's interpretation of Tanaqui's Spellcoats. So we know who this character is. This is this historical figure from Dalemark.
Yes. And Hearn is about to get his, right after they meet Tanamil, Hearn gets his own central romance throughout this book. When they meet, they actually meet the heathen for the first time, and they meet Kars Adon, who is the leader of the small band of heathen that has been running around Dalemark terrorizing everybody.
Right. So I'm kind of torn because, obviously, I do think it's a romance in that I personally would request this as a Yuletide fic. I'm not sure Jones necessarily thinks of it as a romance, but it is certainly a moment of intense meeting and connection between these two young men about the same age from very different cultures who, in that one moment, that they only meet twice, kind of, but the second time they meet, Kars Adon dies, so it's not much of a reunion. But this single meeting transforms them both, changes their lives, sets them on the path for the people they're going to become.
Right, and it is very, very much like the meetings that we've seen in Power of Three between young men who recognize each other. Like, that is the key thing between Kars Adon and Hearn, is they look at each other and they see that they're very much alike. And at first it starts out with that interest that can become friendship or hatred at the drop of a pin. Like, there's just like some essential recognition that becoming, embracing this person who is, like in Power of Three, your enemy of a different race, on a different side, and recognizing that essential similarity means accepting and recognizing a part of yourself, and rejecting that means the opposite.
Right. So it's sort of seeing yourself in someone else, and so starting to understand yourself. So the essential story of Hearn and Kars Adon is boy attempts to conquer boy's homeland.
Right.
Then boy meets boy. And boy says, "You're a bitch. You failed. Conquer my homeland harder if you're gonna. This was shit. You should be embarrassed."
Yes. Exactly.
Which is so inspiring. Yeah, I want to be clear. Hearn and Kars Adon meet, and Kars Adon has failed, right? There are essentially two ongoing conquests of the Riverlands happening. There's the evil wizard who's having a great time and succeeding at everything he does, and who is poisoning the soul of the land, who has turned the river foul so that it brings sickness, and who is gathering up the souls of the dead to use in his dark necromancy. So that's one conqueror, and then the other conqueror is Kars Adon, who is presented as honestly a heroic conqueror. He's come with a band of his people because he's been exiled from his homeland. He's come to settle. He says there's plenty of room for all of us. He's going to found a city. He's going to gather in the scattered bands of his people who already live here, and he's willing to make treaties and treat the natives fairly. if they'll listen to him, and if not, he'll do it by violence instead, and he's not ashamed of that. Um,
Yeah. There's a really interesting, like it is so interesting. I find it a little uncomfortable, but very interesting how uninterested this book is in the moral valence of Kars Adon's conquest. The book is very unsympathetic to the original people of the Riverlands being like, well, you came here and tried to conquer us. Why should we listen to you? It has no interest in that point of view. The eventual resolution between these peoples has to be that they listen to each other and become one.
I will note that I don't think the natives, Tanaquese people, are in fact the original people of the Riverlands, because the whole backstory of like their national story involves the binding of the one by the witch ancestor of Tanaqui when they first came to this country. So the idea that they are also in some way conquerors or the descendants of conquerors.
Yes, that is true. And there's, a lot of sort of destabilization of who has a right to the land. Because I think that
Power of three again.
Power of three again. It's a question that she is fundamentally uninterested in. She does not care about the justice of who should be here. What she cares about is, are we going to be able to live together? There's room for all of us, and therefore we all should be able to live here, as long as we do it in normal, fine ways of conquering and not evil, soul-stealing, river poisoning ways of conquering.
Yeah, I will say that it's clearly presented as like two different kinds of conquest. One tries to steal the soul of the land and is therefore evil. The other just wants to live in the land and is fine.
Yes.
So it's Cancredin who is evil because of his desire to take the whole soul of the Riverlands.
Yes.
Anyway, where was I? I was telling you all about my favourites.
Yes, her and Kars Adon. Boy meets boy, boy calls boy a little bitch.
Right. But what's great is that after this, Hearn and his siblings leave. This is the point where they kind of turn around, like, we've come to the sea, we met a bad wizard, everything's gone wrong, let's turn around and go the other way and see if that's any better. So they're heading up for the source of the river now. And they're not going to see Kars Adon again until nearly the end of the book, nearly the end of the second Spellcode. So we kind of leave him off stage, but it's clear to Tanaqui that Hearn keeps thinking about him.
Yeah.
And keeps wanting him to succeed.
Yes. There's a great...
This boy from this other culture who has come to conquer his homeland, and Hearn said, well, you failed at it and you're shit. Then Hearn actually is rooting for him, wants him to do better.
Yes. There's a bit where she talks about... how it's a good thing that they haven't fought, that, that the king, when they eventually meet the king of their own people, keeps running from Kars Adon and not fighting him, because if it came to a battle, Hearn would be on both sides at once. So there's this sort of divided, both Hearn and Tanaqui, I think, have this kind of divided soul, divided self that we have seen in Cart and Quitter, where, they're on two sides. And like in the description of these people, we will recognize, having read Cart and Quitter and Drowndammit, that the descriptions of the invaders is very like the Northerners. The description of the people that are already there is very like the Southerners. These are sort of the types of people that live in Dalemark now and that are still at odds, but in a different way. And Moral is both of the North and South. And Hearn and Tanaqui, having been looking like the people of the North, raised by the people of the South, having these significant encounters again with the people of the North that, sort of make them feel very sympathetic towards them, end up in this divided position in between both sides.
Right. And then, while the second half of the book is happening, Kars Adon, so inspired by Hearn's insults, goes off and does it?
Yeah.
Just starts conquering Dalemark for real this time, or conquering the Riverlands for real this time, and does a good job, but also sort of nobly makes treaties and is very honourable about it. And we know he does this, because when he meets Tanaqui again, the first thing he does is tell her, and it's like, do you think Hearn will be impressed?
Right. And Tanaqui's like, Tanaqui has been spending this whole book thinking that Hearn is one-sidedly obsessed with Kars Adon. It's like, okay. And then she meets Kars Adon, and it's like, oh no, it was a mutual obsession. Who knew?
Right. They are mutually very weird about each other. You bump into your crush's sister again for the first time since you conquered his country. Like, do you think he'll like it?
Right.
Do you think would you describe his eyes as more green or hazel? Yes. And Tanaqui is like, what? But no, genuinely,
his eyes aren't either green or hazel. They're chalky white and scary. We know this about Hearn.
We do know this about Hearn. But Tanaqui actually is interesting because her reaction to Kars Adon's sort of idealistic, and I think it is presented as an idealistic conquest, a
Yes.
conquest where he's aiming to do it right, do the right thing, treat people well. It talks about how he's been like taking in Riverland's refugees in his camp of heathen,
Right.
future Northerners, and looking after them.
And Tanakui
And he,
walks into the camp and sees, young Riverlands men and women flirting with young heathen men and women. It's the one time that she talks, with like that she approves of romance going on in the book, and she's like, "Well, that's all right then." Is young people are flirting with each other from opposite sides and making up.
that's fine as long as it's not me and I don't have to hear about it.
Right.
Right, but there is this sense that the Kaz Adon sort of vision of Hearn's ideals is kind of a projection.
Yes.
He's actually thought of all this himself. He thinks of it as something he's doing for Hearn, but actually, what eventually transpires is there is finally a meeting, a conflict between the Riverlanders and the invaders, in which both the King of the Riverlands and Kaz Adon are killed.
Yes. Because of the treachery of the King of the Riverlands.
Right.
Again, this sort of this profound lack of sympathy that, I mean, it's not a total lack of sympathy. I think one of the things that I want to talk about is the complexity of these various adult figures, especially in the Riverlands, because we're getting Tanakui's very unsympathetic portrayals of them, but then sometimes that will be overturned, or Tanakui will like somebody and someone else will be like, no, I don't like him at all. So we get, this, none of these perspectives are unquestioned about, Tanakui's opinions of people. But fundamentally, the thing that happens is they make a treaty, and the king breaks it and tries to kill Kars Adon, and in the course of that, both Kars Adon and the king are killed.
Right. And then, by a complicated set of coincidences, first the king has just married Robin that morning, in an attempt to get control of the One, the Undying,
Yes.
which he sees Robin as the guardian of the Undying, which is the soul of the river, the soul of the Riverlands.
Which the king knows and understands, because as king, he is also, again, these sort of relationship marriages, he's also a descendant of the One as the king. Both the king and Kars Adon are descendants of the One. He seems to have like Zeus, he seems to have had massive amounts of children.
Well, if you're Undying, you've got lots of time.
You've got lots of time. So they're both descended from the One, and so they both have, in talking to both these figures, Tanakui is able to come to a better understanding herself of what it means that they are also descendants of the One.
Right. In fact, I'll add as well, another descendant of the One is Cancredin, the evil wizard.
Yes.
He's also got a part of like this divine blood, if you like. So in the Jonesian schema of what is a hero, which I think Delmark sort of examines from many, many angles, this book does go in for the hero is of a special family, of a divinely chosen one from of demigod blood.
Yeah, and it has such an interesting and, again, sort of destabilizing relationship to that, right? Because it does turn out to be true that they are special. They are of demigod blood. But also, there's a couple points in the book where their uncle comes and is like, well, the reason that everybody in the village hated you is because you thought you were so special and you went around acting like you were so special. And Tanakui gets very mad and then is like, well, that's true, we did. And even though it turns out that we are special, we had no cause to act like we were special. We didn't know we were special then. So, there is something about having, you can be special, that gives you a destiny, but you shouldn't go around giving yourself airs because of it.
Right. So, where was I? Series of coincidences.
Right.
The Riverlands king married Robin this morning and has no other living family, so his heir is now Robin's oldest male relative, who surprises Hearn.
Right. Except that's not true. Gull is still around somewhere, and at the end of the book, Tanakui meets Gull briefly running around doing, having been rescued from this evil magic that's on him, but he has to be somewhere else. He can never, because he's like, if I came back, it would mess everything up for her.
Right, he has to change his name even. So that's like, on the one hand, Hearn is now very, very tenuously king of the Riverlands, and on the other hand, it turns out that among Kars Adon's people, you can just name your heir, and everyone has to listen. So Kars Adon dying in Hearn's arms is like, I choose this guy.
Right.
Again, I met once, and he called me a bitch.
Well, I would say, again, this is why I say it's a romance in parallel, because it is a symbolic marriage, right? It's
right.
It's the king marries Robin, and that makes Hearn as her oldest male relative the heir, and Kars Adon marries Hearn in his dying breath. It's like, this is my heir.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair reading. But what it ultimately means is that Hearn stands up and finds himself king of both peoples. He looks like an invader. He was raised in the Riverlands, so he's got this divided, this double self. He's been chosen by both peoples, but it's clear that it's really, really tenuous, and everyone is sort of looking at him like,
It's
this
also,
one?
we then
Really?
afterwards, we then, again, like, all this destabilization that she's doing at all points and all levels on this story, including Hearn's mythic right to be king, because then Tanaqui goes, she wasn't there for the wedding of Robin and the king. They've been trying to put off the wedding of Robin and the king because, of course, Robin is in love with Tanamil and is deeply depressed about the prospect of marrying the king, and all that seems terrible, but it happens while she's gone. They can't put it off. But it happens with Duck, because Tanaqui has taken the coat that she's been making that was, that's a garment that you're supposed to wear during the wedding. And so Duck, who's been learning magic, enchants just like a basket, I think, to look like the coat to put on the king for his marriage. And Tanaqui's
So it wasn't a legitimate marriage.
it wasn't legal. It was a completely illegal marriage. And Duck is like, shh, you cannot tell anybody about that, because if so, we're going to blow up Hearn's spot and he won't be king.
Okay. I think this is really important, though, this destabilization, because I think what Jones is actually doing in Delmark is a king narrative. I'm going to talk about what I mean by that. So books 1 and 2 of the Delmark series, right, are books about a time of revolution imminent. It's really clear from Carton Quitter to Drowned Amit that something has got to give, that social change is coming. Social change is already here in the form of guns and new military technology and new conflict between the North and South. That political change is coming with it, that someday there is going to be a revolution, a transformation in Delmark, right? And then instead of book 3 being, and here's the revolution, book 3 is, here we are, several thousand years back in time, to talk about the first king of Delmark, because that's what Hearn is. He becomes, in legend, in story, in history, Kern Adon, the legendary first king of Delmark. And ultimately, we do know this. Book 4 of Delmark is about the coming of a king. In fact, it is, you could say, the return of the king.
You were really good.
You could. No, it's intentional. It's on purpose, because the king is the protagonist of the nation on a mythic scale, on a narrative level. If you are telling the story of change in a country, you are telling, within this universe, you are telling the story of change in a king. The figure of the king is the country embodied, if you like. That's what the narrative is doing. That's what makes the king a hero. He has to be divinely chosen. He has to be special. He has to be in his own body everything that the country is and everything it's going to be. So Hearn's story as someone who becomes the first king of this double people, the first king of Delmark, is a mythic becoming, which is actually the story of where did Delmark come from? Where did Delmark come from? Where did Hearn come from? These are the same question. So then the question of the return of the king, of what is Delmark going to be, becomes also a mythic question of what is the new king, or who is the new king going to be.
Right. And if you're thinking about this sort of this element of being chosen by the gods or powers, what we are told over and over again in this book, both by the way that they appear and by what Tanamil says about them at the end, that the Undying are not gods, they are the land. So if the king is the protagonist of the land, very literally, these figures that we are seeing as forming this relationship with the spirits of the land, with the Undying, are being chosen by the country in order to lead. And it's not about blood, and it's not about birthright, and it's not about legitimacy. It's about the narrative of this country choosing a person.
Right, which includes the people of the country choosing a person, because Hearn explicitly stands up to all the people of both sides and says, listen, give me 3 days so we can beat Cancredin, the evil wizard, and then you can decide if you still want me to be a king. But right now we've got a crisis, let's solve it.
Right. And we don't know how it turns out except for the afterword. Like, we're not, Hearn says 3 days later after we've beaten the wizard, then we'll build the country if you still want me to do it. And then the book ends on the moment when Tanaqui is like, I think I figured out how to beat the wizard. We're going to see how it goes. And postscript, so we think that Hearn is Kern Adon, who is this legendary figure.
Right? And in fact, I do think that ending is more than just Tanaqui. I think it's Tanaqui speaks as a prophet.
Yes.
In the last few paragraphs of the Spellcoats, Tanaqui stops writing a description of the past and writes a description of the future.
Right.
And it is clear that through her power to tell the story that's true, to understand the past, she has come to a true understanding where she can weave the future.
Yes.
And what she weaves is what will come to pass. And what she weaves is the unbinding of the river, of the one, so the releasing of this figure in his full power, and therefore the destruction of the river, so that the country itself will be utterly changed. And we know from the change of maps that prehistoric Delmark and contemporary Delmark do not look the same. There is no giant river in contemporary Delmark.
Right. And I do think I want to draw a distinction a little bit. This is going to sound flatly contradictory.
Go on.
But between the protagonist of Tanaqui's story that she is writing and the protagonist of the book The Spellcoats. Like
Ooh.
I think Hearn is the protagonist of Tanaqui's story. Like what we are seeing throughout this book is the invention of the writer as protagonist and central figure of a Diana Wynne Jones book, the person who has the power to craft the narrative by which the protagonist of that narrative, in this case being Hearn, is able to come into his destiny and become, in this case, the king of the land.
Right. The ultimate defeat of the wizard Cancredin is brought about by Tanaqui, who could only do it because Hearn and his armies of the two peoples are holding off the bad guys.
Right.
But you're right. It's a on a meta level, the hero is Tanaqui, the storyteller, telling the story of Hearn, the once a future king.
Yes, and throughout the previous book, she's like flirted with the power of words. I think we see it come up the most directly in Power of Three, which has word magic as one of its sort of central three strands of magic. But here's like, we haven't talked at all about the mages. Tanaqui, in the middle of the book, they have their first fight with the mages, which is when Tanaqui starts to realize that mages wear these coats, and the coats have spells woven into them, and they say things that the mages are, by the act of weaving those coats, becoming true. So they say things like, I brought the hidden death, and
I tortured the beast.
I tortured the beast. And Tanaqui is like, oh, eventually realizes that, oh, by weaving, I brought the hidden death. That's what brings the hidden death. And then she realizes that I think this is, again, this comes back to gender and to craft in a really interesting way. Although she is a child, and when she meets the other mages, they laugh at her because they look at her weaving what she has. Her siblings are wearing she and her siblings are wearing what she's woven, and it's bad. It's child's work. It's, Duck is wearing a shirt that says duck, 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 and all the bands around his cuffs. And Tanaqui is wearing her worst skirt ever. She spends like significant page space in the book talking about how embarrassed she is by this terrible skirt that she's made.
Right, right. So the shirt with duck written around it, though, ends up being a valuable misdirect because it makes the mages think that her brother's name is Duck.
Yes,
which is not. So when they try to control him by calling his name, they're calling the wrong name, and that gives Duck the space to escape from their power.
Right.
And then the skirt, I love how much time she spends on the skirt, because the story of the skirt is Tanaqui goes, so annoying, I've only written little bits of it here and there, and you're like, but what is that thing that you've kind of half written? And it is the story of their parents.
Yes, and she says it's a nursery rhyme, which has all these interesting implications that never get unpacked about how much the story of her parents was prophesied, was fated to begin with. And you do get one of the things about the story of their parents is that her mother, after marrying her father, the one cut her off. They had this terrible fight. And then Tanaqui meets the one and is sort of like, oh, you set that up. There's
a lot of the story actually is Tanaqui going, wait, you set that up.
Yeah.
There's a coherence, there's a structure underneath what seemed at first to me to be a random set of bad happenings. Actually, this is a story.
Right.
It makes sense.
This is all the long game on the part of the one to unbind himself, to unbind the river and allow him to take back his power and free the land. But in the course of, after this encounter, what Tanaqui realizes is that she is in fact a better weaver than any of the other mages. Like, the enemy mages have loose, bad weaving. They are weaving for the spell, but they're not weaving for the craft. They don't understand the craft of weaving. And Tanakui is a really, really, really good weaver, and she can, in fact, weave 276 pages of text into 2 coats, which is very tiny weaving.
Right, she's really judgy about the weaving that these mages do, and then it is revealed later that their spell coats, literally the spell coats of the mages are their bodies. All these mages are said to have passed through death in order to gain their power, and to have therefore become necromancers, and therefore they don't have bodies anymore, and only their coats give them bodies
Right.
and make them immortal. And then once Tanakui realizes that, she tells Hearn and his army, like, cut up the coats and it'll kill the mages.
And Hearn, meanwhile, with his power of rationality, has been like, well, the reason that when I went to go visit an evil mage, my soul didn't get sucked out by evil mages like my brothers did, is because I just told myself that they couldn't do it. So, get good, everybody else.
Everyone else skill issue, be an atheist harder, it'll work.
Right. Rip to my brother, but I'm different.
I love Hearn so much. But I wanted to talk about, before we go on,
yes,
pass through death to get power.
Yes,
which is what you do. You can't. Death by water brings you power, as in the death of Clennon, which gives Morrill his power. Clennon, who died by the lake, as in the death at sea of Mitt and Innan and Hildy, which brings Mitt to his moment of power when he's given the names of the gods in the islands. Death by water to gain power.
Yes,
and Tanakui goes all the way down the river to the sea and passes through the net of souls, which the evil mage has woven to control the dead. She passes through death by water, and she begins to come into her power as a mage.
Yes. And the one is the power of this land is all of these powers, these undying, are associated with waters, with rivers. The one, and Tanamel, who's the younger, the tributary river, the younger brother. And it's made very, very explicit all throughout the course of this text that the power of water is what gives the land its power, and what gives the narrative its power.
So what's the water?
Death.
Right. And in fact, we've been told this from almost the beginning. The moment Gull comes back from war, he talks about his dreams of rushing figures and running along and running down to the sea. But even before that, before he ever goes away, when Tanakui first sees the army off to war, her father and Gull among them, she says they've become like water. They've become like a river as they go off to die.
The crowd of people do as he says, not willingly, not fast, so that the army flows off like the river, brown and sluggish and all one piece, as if people could become like water, all one thing. We could hardly distinguish father or Gull, though we looked hard, they had become all one with the rest. And it's just that, I think we haven't talked very much about how this book is a war book, and because it's not front of mind, it's primarily a mythic book, but the horrors of war are kind of, and the horrors of death and the fear of death are a background, texture of this tapestry that Tanakui is weaving all throughout, as they're going up and down the river.
When they see the bodies floating in the river.
Yeah.
When they see, really, it's a striking sequence where the river has flooded as a consequence of the struggles between Cancredin and the One, and they sort of row over what was once a city in the palace of their king, and see it all drowned underwater.
Yeah. And all throughout, again, you get this feeling that Tanakui can't talk about it too much because she feels it too much. She like, there are a couple times she'll be like, I don't want to weave about this. Or then she unpicks the lament of her father. Like, they are living through a terrifying time. They're seeing death all around them. And like Morrill, Tanakui is losing her family one after another. She loses her father. She loses Gull. Gull, like Dagner, is not dead, but has gone, has been...
Is imprisoned. Is bound.
She starts to lose Robin first so Robin spends the entire second half of this book very, very ill. And eventually we learn that she's willing herself to die because she thinks that is the best thing that she can do to get them all out of the situation that they're in with the king who wants to marry her. And so she's watching Robin waste away and sad and furious about it. And
right. So basically, bit by bit, losing the responsible figures, the
Yes.
adults in the story, and this sort of hard on the heels of a couple of books where, like, you've had the parents heroically show up at the end, or the parental figures, like Amit and Libby, or like Crestomancy. Yeah, there's no parents here.
No.
Tanaqui eventually has to just do it herself. It is through her prophecy, her true weaving, that the one will be unbound. Her grandfather, who Kaz Adon calls the grandfather, so the sort of the father of all the people
Yes.
of this divided country.
But he can't save him. Neither he nor Tanamil can do very much because of the ways in which they're bound. So
Right, they
it's
can't save themselves.
so it's not like, I mean, and again, this does and doesn't echo with Amit and Libby Beer with Mid. Amit and Libby Beer can and do turn up to help them, but and like we talked about them as parent figures, but the ways in which they help them are predicated on them getting up and helping themselves, and on them making the choices that they need that can't be made for them. But here it's, it takes it one step further. These figures, Tanamil and the One, need Tanaqui, need the children to save them, to allow them to unleash their power. There's, they cannot save the kids. The kids, it's reversed. The kids have to save the great figures of the land.
And in doing so, step into their own mythic roles, which it is suggested they will not be stepping out again. Like Tanaqui will remain the sorceress, the witch, the weaver that she becomes. Hearn will be the king. Um, this one feels much more coming of age to me than a lot of other. Although interestingly, Drowned Amit also had that sort of coming of age moment, that stepping into adulthood, that adult choice.
Right. But in Drowned Amit, at the very end, they do get to be children again.
Yes, a dad turns up.
A dad turns up, and no dad is turning up in Spellcoats. It's a book, as you said, very absent in parents. No bad parents, just absent parents, parents who are gone. There is a bad aunt,
Right.
but we can't get away without one of those.
Yeah,
But
no, there's still a horrible older woman in the background, because you can't have a Diana Wynne Jones book in which a horrible older woman does not exist.
although even she gets complicated, like a little bit at the end when we learn, there's the great big army going on, and the women of the Riverlands, led by horrible Aunt Zara, are going out and tackling mages. And Tanaqui says, "Aunt Zara, I think you're wonderful," and means it in the moment, even though she knows that her aunt is going to be horrible again the next day. But sometimes, if you can lose your horrible aunt at somebody else and set her to murdering mages, that's a good outlet for her energies. She just needed enrichment. She needed some mages to murder.
Right, but you're right. There's no parents who are ever coming to save the day, or even to pick you up and dust you off after you've already saved the day yourself. You, in fact, they do encounter their mother again, right? All three of their undying figures they will meet in the flesh, in person. Their mother, turns out, their mother is the river, far more so than the grandfather, who is, if you like, the soul behind the river, the creator of the river.
Right.
Their mother is the river itself, which means that at the end of the book, when the river is destroyed and modern Dalemark's landscape is created by Tanaqui's prophecy, yeah, she just killed her mother.
Yeah, she
and,
did.
And in fact, her mother says, "I'm ready. I want to go down to the sea to be with my husband." So she is choosing, in fact, the ultimate fate of anyone who has a forbidden romance across divine and mortal lines is death, because the ultimate fate of those who love is death.
Yep.
And that even goes for the undying.
Yeah. There's no happy ending for these romances. There's
Oh, we think Robin does marry Tanamil, and they seem all right.
That's true, but it's not. What we see in the book is Robin is dying for love of Tanamil. Then Robin has to marry the king and ends up married to the king for a day. And then at the end, we're told that Robin never shows up in the stories, but may have something to do with the fact that you can ask a Robin for help in times of trouble. She doesn't become a mythic figure. She's an ordinary person. She becomes an ordinary person.
She escapes.
She escapes. Yeah. That's probably for the best.
And in fact, I think death is also presented as a kind of escape, if you like, from this world of mythic permanence. The undying are stuck being the myth forever, but those who go down the river to the sea, there's that very moving moment when Tanaqui sees the souls fighting free of the net that the evil Cancredin has put across the
Yes.
river, and she sees them flying out to the ocean. And Cancredin's spell talks about keeping souls from their long home.
Yes.
So there is a sense that death is not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a frightening thing and it's a powerful thing, but I do think their mother's eventual freedom to go to be with their father is not presented as tragic.
Right. It's the same. I mean, I think both their mother and Robin, I think, are like Robin is following in their mother's footsteps. She's marrying someone inappropriate. She
The mother
is
even says, "I'm afraid it's in the family." Their
yes,
grandfather did this too. This was how he got bound. He
right.
married, he fell in love with a human witch who's said to be the ancestress of the Riverlands people, and she bound him.
Yes. Um, and there's this really the passage that I've been looking for is when Tanaqui meets her grandfather for the first time. And all throughout the book, this figure of the one, other like the kids fight over who gets to hold the different undying, but no one wants to hold the one. He's cold, he pulls away. He's a frightening figure, even though he's a powerful figure. And she's Tanaqui is confronting him about his treatment of her mother. And she says, Closti, my father, wasn't in the least like Slenbleth, the witch who bound you. You might have forgiven her. And he paused again before answering sadly and hesitantly, I am very devious, granddaughter. You would not be here now if I had. So he's been, he played a little bit on his anger. And then Tanaqui says, it came to me that my grandfather was not only bound and sad and weighted with shame and loneliness, but even uncertain how to talk to an ordinary person like me. I had not thought it was possible to love him until then. So it's only when she sees him as a flawed figure who can't save her, who needs her help, that they actually are able to form this connection.
Yeah, he's a very like for a character who like explicitly appears very seldom in the book. He's actually a very powerful figure all the way through, and it turns out that every time Tanaqui finishes a spellcoat, she looks at it and there is the outline of her grandfather. The shadow of her grandfather is in the pattern. That the story is ultimately about him.
Yeah.
In some way.
And it's such a incredible metaphor for the act of creativity that you write put all of your, and specifically I think for the way that Diana Wynne Jones writes books, which is you put everything that you're thinking about, this whole jumble of assorted details, of small details that form this narrative and form these characters and this characterization, and then you take it out and you look at it and you see the shadow of the thing that you really wanted to write about just kind of strung through all these little details of like word by word and sentence by sentence.
Yeah, no, it feels very true to me in terms of how I work and what it feels like to me to write a book.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is the first book where she is, and again, I don't want to, Tanaqui is a character, as Moral is a character, but I think she uses both of them as ways to talk about what creativity feels like. And it's part of what makes these books so interesting is that it feels she's writing, as Tanaqui and Moral are, she's writing something true. She's telling something that is true about what it's like to tell a story.
Because it must be true to have power to be the fire that fetches thunder.
Yes. Even if
Should we call it there?
I want to say one last thing.
Go on.
Just about the end of this book, which is people will find it years later and won't believe it or won't understand it. Like, I think there's the final element of this book is about interpretation and about you put your truth into the world and then no one is going to understand exactly what you meant by it. It is full of like hidden codes, words and phrases and things that mean something to you and to nobody else. But people can find and make meaning out of it. And that is what we are being presented in this book, is an object that has had meaning made out of it through various layers that we are trying to talk through these layers to the person who's telling the story. Which is, I think, what we've been trying to do this whole season with 8 Days of Diana Wynne Jones. So thank you to Diana for having this be the last book of the 70s, because I think that's a really good note to end the season on.
Right, and thank you all very much for listening to our little passion project here. I hope you've enjoyed 8 Days Diana Wynne Jones, 8 Days, 9 Books. Season 2, when we come to it, is the 1980s, which is a hell of a time in Diana Wynne Jones' creative output, and I'm
Yeah, a
looking
lot
forward
of
to it.
favorite books in there. So yeah, really excited. Thank you everybody for listening. And there is we've been talking about maybe doing a bonus recap episode for the end of the season. So pay attention if you follow us on any of our social medias. We'll probably be putting out a call for questions or things you want us to talk about. So
I
stay
mean, I
tuned.
mean, I just want to argue with you about rankings. Like, as
Yeah.
far as I'm concerned, some of these books are a lot better than others, and I want to complain about which ones are the best.
Yes, I want to argue
Complain
about
about, yeah.
rankings, and I want to put forward conspiracy theories about Hoban. So
Oh yeah, yeah. No, we say bonus episode. Actually, we're just going to talk about Drowned Amit for another hour.
yeah,
We could do that.
we can so easily do that. All right, thanks everybody, and that's it. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.